All right. On to the third paralogism. I heard somebody pronounce it paralogism. Kind of seems more right. But I'm going to stick with paralogism. But it's fine. Anybody can say it either way they want. If they're reading Kant, they're okay by me. Or if they're not, doesn't matter. Okay, the third paralogism of personality. Whatever is conscious of the numerical identity of itself at different times is, insofar, a person. Okay? Now the soul is conscious of the numerical identity of itself at different times. Therefore, it is a person. Okay. Criticism of the third paralogism of transcendental psychology. If I want to know through experience the numerical identity of an external object, If I want to know through experience the numerical identity of an external object, I shall have to attend to what is permanent in that appearance, to which, as the subject, everything else refers as determination, and shall observe the identity of the former in the time that the latter changes. Okay, you'll have to attend to what is permanent in the appearance, that's the former part, and everything else refers as determination. And as the subject, everything else refers as determination, and shall observe the identity of the former in the time that the latter changes. I myself, however, am an object of inner sense, and all time is but the form of inner sense. I therefore refer each and every one of my successive determinations to the numerically identical self, and do so in all time, that is, in the form of the inner intuition of myself. Okay, and I think what Kant is saying is, like, I have this, like, I don't know, awareness of myself, and I have it, among different times, and I attribute those successive determinations, like those moments of self-awareness, to myself, among different times. This is a pretty confusing way to say it, but from this point of view, the personality of the soul should not even be considered as inferred, but as an entirely identical proposition of self-consciousness in time. Okay? And this is indeed the reason why it is valid a priori, for it really says no more than this, that in the whole time in which I am conscious of myself, I am conscious of this time as belonging to the unity of myself. Yeah, that makes sense. And as long as you're conscious, like, that's going to be true. So I get that you don't have to necessarily experience that. Like, experience is probably not helpful for determining that. And it comes to the same thing whether I say that this whole time is within me as individual unity, or that I, with numerical identity, am to be found in all this time. In my own consciousness, therefore, the identity of person is inevitably present. But if I consider myself from the point of view of another person as an object of his outer intuition, then this external observer considers me, first of all, in time. For in apperception, time is in fact represented only in me. Right. For in apperception, time is in fact represented only in me. Right. So your apperception of the unity, I think is what he's talking about, that's only represented inwardly in him. But if somebody else considers yourself, it's not an inward thing. It's not an apperception thing. They're effectively just observing an object. You're the same as a fucking orange or a chair or something. No offense. Although he admits, therefore, the I which at all times, and with full identity, accompanies all my representations in my consciousness, he will not yet infer from the objective permanence of myself. For as in this case, the time in which the observer posits me is not the time of my own sensibility, but of his. It follows that the identity which is necessarily connected with my consciousness is not therefore connected with his, that is, with the outer intuition of my subject. Okay, makes sense. The identity of the consciousness of myself at different times is therefore only a formal condition of my thoughts and their coherence, and proves in no way the numerical identity of my subject. Agreed. And okay, so I get what he's getting. So like, you know, it feels, I don't know, it feels more personal or maybe more real or maybe more consistent for our inner sense to like numerically, meaning kind of chronologically in time, to march forward and be a continuous self. But it, you know, and that makes sense to us, but that's not really true, because like me, I am just in my presence and identity and whatever expressions, thoughts that I say at least, to somebody else is just the same as observing something else. So we might give it this privileged idea, but when you kind of change the perspective there, that kind of falls apart and isn't necessarily true. In this subject, despite the logical identity of the I, a change may have occurred such as to make it impossible to retain its identity, though we may still attribute to it the same name of I, which in every other state, and even in the change of the subject, might yet retain the thought of the preceding subject and hand it over to the subsequent one. That's interesting. And so I think I think he's saying, excuse me, there's no reason that like from second to second, or I don't know, let's say waking up tomorrow morning, because there's a pretty significant lapse of self-awareness when you sleep. There's no reason that couldn't be a different self, right? There's no limitation on that. Frankly, I had this like, I don't know. I had this idea when I was younger in college, and, being a stupid undergrad that thought he was smart, like a cut in a movie. Think of a cut in a movie. It's in a way like, we like splice them together in our head and they're connected, but, they're not at all. You know what I mean? Like they are, could be on completely different days, even though they kind of look the same or seem the same or part of the same conversation or something. And like the cuts are really the death of the actual unity of that moment, right? And that's kind of the way I've been thinking about this. Like there are so many cuts in your life, and I don't even just mean like I said, sleeping, but there are like several instances of like, I don't know, there's just, when you just aren't aware of yourself for a couple seconds and you think about something and you drift off, and then, you snap back and you're like, oh shit. I don't know. There's no reason that those things couldn't be a completely different experience or self, or frankly, I think they maybe could be. Like, I don't know. Just because I don't know. I have memories of I'm going to stop talking. Anyway, so that's a cool story that I thought I'd share. Let's keep going. Although the teaching of some old schools that everything is in a flux and nothing in the world is permanent and enduring cannot be admitted once we assume substances, yet it is not refuted by the unity of self-consciousness. For we ourselves cannot judge our own consciousness, whether as souls we are permanent or not, because we reckon as belonging to our own identical self only that of which we are conscious, and therefore are constrained to judge that in the whole time of which we are conscious, we are one and the same. Right. It's interesting because this is like completely intertwined with consciousness. So we couldn't like think of this independently of our consciousness. But our consciousness is kind of what we're trying to untangle here, and our sense of self. So, okay. From the point of view of a stranger, however, such a judgment would not be valid, because perceiving in the soul no permanent appearances, except the representation of the I, which accompanies and connects them all, we cannot determine whether this I, a mere thought, be not the same state of flux as the other thoughts which are chained together by the I. It is curious, however, that the personality of the soul and what is presupposed by it, namely its permanence and hence substantiality, must now first of all be proved. It is curious, however, that the personality of the soul and what is presupposed by it, namely its permanence and hence its substantiality, must now first of all be proved. For if we presuppose these, there would follow, if not the continuance of consciousness, yet the possibility of a continuing consciousness in an enduring subject. If not the continuance of consciousness, yet the possibility of a continuing consciousness in an enduring subject. And this is sufficient to establish personality. Speaking of personality, I am very hot and I need to take my sweatshirt off. Sorry. Okay, sorry. Put my glasses back on. Sorry. Okay, sorry. I don't know who I'm apologizing to, but if you're listening, sorry for that interruption. This permanence, however, is by no means given to us prior to the numerical identity of ourselves, which we infer from the identical apperception. On the contrary, this permanence itself is inferred from this numerical identity, and if the argument proceeded rightly, this permanent would first be followed by the concept of substance, which is applicable only empirically. Yeah, that's interesting. Like, meaning, it would probably make more sense. I think what he's saying is, like, as opposed to making this a logical argument related to the consciousness, it might make more sense to maybe pose it as a numerical identity related to your body, which we actually, I don't know, somebody could conceivably observe. I suppose you wouldn't be able to consistently observe it, but your mind is a little bit tougher. But as the identity of person follows by no means from the identity of the I in the consciousness of all time in which I know myself, we were unable earlier in the argument to found upon the substantiality of the soul. Okay? Like the concepts of substance and of the simple, however, the concept of personality may also remain with us, insofar it is merely transcendental, that is, as a concept of the unity of the subject, which is otherwise unknown to us, but in the determinations of which there is thoroughgoing connection through apperception. Right, like the personality is still a thing, I think, right? We just don't know if it's if I am the same person that I was yesterday, which is fine. It's fine. In this sense, the concept is necessary and sufficient, for practical use, but we can never pride ourselves on it as helping to expand our self-knowledge through pure reason, which only deceives us when it shows us, from the mere concept of the identical self, an uninterrupted continuance of the subject. Right, we can't pure reason ourselves into this. It's just, there's too many breaks, and yeah, it just doesn't work. Okay. It kind of freaks me out when I actually understand what Kant is saying on the first. I'm not saying I'm getting everything perfectly, or maybe I'm not, but I'm kind of on board. Feels weird. For this concept revolves perpetually around itself, and does not help us with respect to any question which aims at synthetic knowledge. What matter may be as a thing in itself, as transcendental object, is entirely unknown to us, although we may observe its permanence as appearance, since it is represented as something external. If, however, I wish to observe the mere I in the change of all representations, I have no other correlate for my comparisons, but again myself, with the general conditions of my consciousness. Therefore, I cannot give any but tautological answers to all questions, because I put my concept and its unity in the place of the properties that belong to me as an object, and thus merely take for granted what others wish to know. Okay, that was a good paralogism. Thanks, Kant. We're on to 4. That's pretty good. The fourth paralogism of ideality, with regard to outer relations. I forgot to mention, I watched a really good video from the Cynical Philosopher YouTube page. I just wanted to shout them out. They had some really good notes and just like a really simple explanation. Not simple, but like straightforward explanation of each of the paralogisms, which was helpful to me. Okay, fourth paralogism of ideality with regard to outer relations. That the existence of which can only be inferred as a cause of given perceptions has merely a doubtful existence. Okay, the existence of which can only be inferred as a cause of given perceptions has a merely doubtful existence. Now, all outer appearances are such that their existence cannot be perceived immediately, but that we can only infer them as a cause of given perceptions. Now all outer appearances are such that their existence cannot be perceived immediately, but that we can only infer them as the cause of given perceptions. Okay. Those are like things as appearances, as opposed to like actually knowing what a thing is in itself. Therefore, the existence of all objects of outer senses is doubtful. This uncertainty I call the ideality of outer appearances. Okay? And the doctrine of that ideality is called idealism. In comparison with which other assertions of a possible certainty with regard to objects of the outer senses is called dualism. Okay, I just don't understand the first one. It's just these like passive sentences that load everything into whatever. That the existence of which can only be inferred as a cause of given perceptions. So if something can only be inferred as a cause of given perceptions, okay, has a merely doubtful existence. So, I mean, that's everything for Kant, isn't it? Because everything is an appearance. We don't actually know things in itself. The only things we know are funneled through our perception, and therefore everything has a doubtful existence. He might limit that to like as a thing in itself, because it certainly exists as an appearance in that situation. Okay. Now I'm going to reread the other two, now that I kind of have that down maybe. Now, all outer appearances are such that their existence cannot be perceived immediately. Oh, is there baseball on right now? like to have some baseball on in the background. Playoff baseball. Why can't we shorten the season, man? It's 2025. Fucking 90-game season and 16-team playoff. 16 teams. Get them all in there. Baseball's the one sport where you should have 16 teams. Because if any sport, like a baseball team that is an 8 seed that's, probably not that good, could absolutely win even a 7-game series against the number 1 seed. Baseball's fucking crazy, man. Sorry. Rant over. The Dodgers are playing the Reds. The Reds could absolutely beat the Dodgers. I guess the Reds are like actually in the playoffs proper, so it isn't exactly like an 8 seed. What would be the 8 seed? Let's just sorry non-baseball fans, but let's go to the standings here, baseball standings. This is the divisions are just so stupid, and the wild card is so stupid. I'm sorry. I get that there's like, historical implications, and it's cool, like the divisions, like they're just teams are associated with each other. I'm not saying you shouldn't have, what is it? Isn't it like you have like 19 division games or some shit? Home and away is like 38 total. I don't know. Whatever. I haven't watched baseball very closely in a while. Okay, so the 8 seed in the American League would be the Rangers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The Royals. 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah. Playing the Blue Jays. Or the Yankees. I can't really tell. I mean, the Royals are an 82-80 team. 8 seed in the National League. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 8 would be the San Francisco Giants at 500. That's pretty good cutoff. It's not like you're like, if you did 8 seeds, you would have, I don't know, like a 60-win team making it in. Maybe you would some years, but whatever. Sorry. Okay. Okay, that the existence of which can only be inferred as a cause of given perceptions has merely a doubtful existence. Now all outer appearances are such that their existence cannot be perceived immediately, but that we can only infer them as a cause of given perceptions. Yeah. Therefore, I hate signing on to these because I feel like they're traps. But that makes sense based on like what we've learned so far in this book. Therefore, the existence of all objects of the outer senses is doubtful. This uncertainty I call the ideality of outer appearances, and the doctrine of that ideality is called idealism, in comparison with which the other assertion of a possible certainty with regard to objects of the outer senses is called dualism. Criticism of the fourth paralogism of the transcendental psychology. We shall first have to examine the premises. We are perfectly justified in maintaining that only that which is within ourselves can be perceived immediately, and that solely my own existence can be the object of a mere perception. I'm going to try to stand and read. I think I've done that before. I'm not sure. So that solely my own existence can be the object of a mere perception. Okay. Meaning everything else is kind of a mediated experience, like the computer monitor in front of me and stuff. Like it's an object outside of me, and I have to like funnel it through my perceptions and senses, and then the apperception unity of the whatever, and then I can actually kind of experience it. The only thing that I actually experience, like immediately, perceptively, is myself. There's no I don't know. There's no barrier in between my perception of myself. The existence, therefore, of a real object outside me, taking this word in its intellectual meaning, can never be given directly in perception. See, Kant, I'm with you. Perception, sorry, I'm being so annoying tonight. Perception is a modification of inner sense, and the existence of the actual object can be added to it as being its external cause, only in thought. Perception is a modification of inner sense, right? And the existence of the actual object can be added to it as being its external cause, only in thought, yes, and thus can only be inferred. Hence, Descartes was justified in limiting all perception in the narrowest sense to the proposition, I, as a thinking being, am. For it must be clear that since what is without is not within me, I cannot find it in my apperception, nor therefore in any perception which is in reality only the determination of apperception. I cannot therefore perceive external things, but can only infer their existence from my own inner perception, by taking the perception as the effect of which something external must be the proximate cause. An inference, however, from a given effect to a definite cause is always uncertain. Yeah, okay. Because the effect may be due to more than one cause. Therefore, in referring a perception to its cause, interesting, it always remains doubtful whether that cause be internal or external. Whether in fact all so-called outer perceptions are not a mere play of inner sense. Interesting. So, like, perception of outer things, well, first of all, like, effectively there's like a cause and effect relationship, he's saying, with perception. Like, an object in the world causes you to have the perception of it. That's the effect. And if there is an effect, there could be multiple causes of it. And the cause in that situation, perceiving something, could be completely external, it could be completely internal, or it could be some combination of the two. But we can't know what they are. What the answer is to that question. Okay. That's really an interesting way to put it. I feel like he said that before, but yeah, just hitting different. Therefore, in referring a perception to its cause, it always remains doubtful that whether that cause be internal or external. Whether in fact all so-called outer perceptions are not a mere play of our inner sense, or point to actual external objects as their cause. At all events, the existence of the latter is only inferred and is liable to the dangers of all inferences, while the objective inner sense, I myself, with all my representations, is perceived immediately, and its existence does not admit of being doubted. Right, okay. Yeah. It must not be supposed, therefore, that an idealist is he who denies the existence of external objects of the senses. All he does is to deny that this existence is known through immediate perception, and to infer that we can never by way of any possible experience become perfectly certain of their reality. And isn't this like the line that Descartes, Kant draws between himself and Berkeley? Doesn't Berkeley take the position that since we can't know that, everything is idea? Like everything is inner sense, and nothing is external? But Kant is just kind of being a little more wishy-washy and saying, no, we can't know to what extent it's inner, outer, in some combination. Before I expose the deceptive illusion of our paralogism, let me remark what we must necessarily distinguish, that we must necessarily distinguish two kinds of idealism. Two kinds of idealism: transcendental and the empirical. By transcendental idealism, I mean the doctrine that all appearances are regarded as mere representations. I'm going to write these down. I feel like we've covered these before, but I just want to have them sitting there so when I read this again in 5 minutes, I can just look at this really quickly and be like, oh yeah, that's the definition. Okay, so we have trans idealism, which is the doctrine that all appearances are mere representations, not things in themselves. Things in themselves. Okay. And that space and time, therefore, are only sensible forms of our intuition, not determinations given independently by themselves, or conditions of objects taken as things in themselves. He loses me a little bit on that second part, and I was listening to the video about this. So how does it follow that? So all appearances are mere representations, and not things in themselves, and that space and time, therefore, are only sensible forms, like they're forms, because they're so space and time are not things in themselves. And so space and times are not things in themselves. They're also not appearances, because that's just doesn't... They're a little bit more foundational than that, so we put them in the form bucket as opposed to the appearance bucket. Okay. I think that makes sense. Opposed to the transcendental idealism is the transcendental realism. Okay. Writing that down. Which considers space and time as something, S and T, something given in itself. Okay. Transcendental realism considers space and time as something given in itself, independent. Let me put that. Okay. Independent of sensibility. Thus, the transcendental realist imagines that all outer appearances, their reality being admitted, are things in themselves, existing independently of us and our sensibility, and therefore existing outside us, also according to pure concepts of the understanding. It is this transcendental realist who afterwards acts as the empirical idealist. Okay, hold on. Actually, the cynical philosopher video I watched had a table related to this, and I took a picture of it. And I'm looking at that now. Okay. So, transcendental idealism admit the existence of the external world. Yes. But without admitting more than the certainty of representations within oneself. It's confusing. All appearances are mere representations, not things in themselves. Okay. I like my way better, or definition better. I mean, it's just Kant's definition. Transcendental realism. Space, time, and external objects actually exist independent of our senses and are the cause of our perceptions. Appearances are of the noumena. I'm not sure what that means exactly. Because what is an appearance for that person? Okay. And then we have, they just talked about, or Kant just talked about, the transcendental realist, blah, 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 imagines that all outer appearances, their reality being admitted, are things in themselves existing independently of our sensibility and therefore existing outside us. It is the transcendental realist who afterwards acts as the empirical idealist. Okay, so the transcendental realist is also an empirical idealist. Okay. Who, after wrongly presupposing that the objects of the senses, if they are to be external, must have an existence in themselves and without our senses, yet from this point of view considers all our representations of the senses as insufficient to render the reality of these objects certain. So the empirical idealist believes that, or considers, representations of the senses are insufficient to make objects certain. Okay, so the empirical idealist would be somebody, they believe that things are provided to us, space and time are something given in and of itself, independent of sense, and that objects are, things in themselves, but the senses are insufficient for us to know those objects with certainty. The transcendental idealist, okay, we're probably going to go. The transcendental idealist, on the contrary, may well be an empirical realist. Oh, God. Okay, empirical realist. Empirical. These notes are so bad. I should have just typed them. Why do I insist on writing everything? If you write stuff, you remember it better. It's been proven. I don't know if that's true, but it's been proven. Empirical idealist. On the contrary, may well be an empirical realist. I fucking wrote idealist, damn it. Empirical realist. Or as he is called, a dualist. Okay? That is, he may admit the existence of matter without taking a step beyond mere self-consciousness. So he admits the existence of matter, that's awful nice of him, without taking a step beyond mere self-consciousness, and without admitting more than the certainty of representations within me. That is, the cogito, ergo sum. So what? Empirical realist, let's see what the cynical philosopher has to say about that. Empirical realist. The external objects are real in that they exist in space, but in the space that exists in our intuition, matter is phenomenal. Objects are real but space equals intuition. Okay. I don't know if that's right. That seems right. And that's what Kant is. Would Kant be like a transcendental realist / empirical realist / dualist? Maybe. Who knows? For since he considers matter, and even its inner possibility, only as appearance, which if we separated from our sensibility is nothing, right? This matter, therefore, is for him only a species of representations, intuition, which are called external, And they are called external not as referring to objects that are in themselves external, but because they refer to perceptions because they refer perceptions to the space in which all things are external to one another, while the space itself is in us. Yeah, okay. We have declared ourselves from the very beginning in favor of the transcendental idealism. All appearances are mere representations, not a thing in themselves. Yes. In our system, therefore, huzzah! In our system, therefore, we need not hesitate to admit the existence of matter on the testimony of mere self-consciousness, and to consider it as established thereby in the same matter as the existence of myself as a thinking being. I am conscious of my representations, and hence they exist as well as I myself have these representations. External objects, bodies, however, are mere appearances, and are therefore nothing but one species of my representations, the objects of which are something only through them, and apart from them they are nothing. Okay? External things therefore exist, as well as I myself do, and both indeed do so on the immediate testimony of my self-consciousness. Right. It hinges on self-consciousness. Without the consciousness, there wouldn't be anything, according to this theory, position. The only difference is that the representation of myself as a thinking subject, here we go, as a thinking subject, the only difference is that the representation of myself as a thinking subject is referred merely to inner sense, while the representations which indicate beings are referred as to the outer sense. Yeah. With respect to the reality of external objects, I need to make as little inference as with respect to the reality of the outer object of my inner sense, with respect to the reality of my thoughts. For both objects are nothing but representations, the immediate perception, consciousness, of which is at the same time sufficient proof of their reality. Okay. And he's saying, I don't really need to, I think what he's saying is, I can prove the inner sense, or the inner, my inner sense just as easily as my outer senses, because they're all appearances, and so therefore my experience of them is sufficient to prove them. I don't have to go through all this stuff to figure out what an object is in itself, and stuff. They're both kind of readily known to me because I don't have to prove they are more than mere appearances, I think. The transcendental idealist is therefore an empirical realist. All right, lay it on me, Kant. And allows to matter as appearance a reality which does not need to be inferred, but is immediately perceived. Right, that's kind of what I was getting at. The transcendental realism, on the contrary, is necessarily left in doubt. Right. Space and time, something given in itself. So, objects in themselves, as they are in themselves, is left in doubt, and is obliged to give way to empirical idealism. The representatives of senses are insufficient to make an object certain. That's empirical idealism. I'm glad I wrote these down. It's very helpful. For it considers the objects of outer senses as something distinct from the senses themselves, and so takes mere appearances as independent beings existing outside us. And while with the very best consciousness of our representation of these things, it is far from certain that if a representation exists, then its corresponding object must also exist. And while with the very best consciousness of our representation of these things, it is far from certain that If a representation exists, then its corresponding object must also exist. Yeah, it's not certain. That's not certain. Yet it is clear that in our system of external things, that is, matter in all shapes and alterations, are nothing but mere appearances, that is, representations within us, of the reality of which we are immediately conscious. Okay. As far as I know, all psychologists who believe in empirical idealism, literally going to look at it again, empirical idealism, senses, representations of the senses are insufficient to make objects certain. As far as I know, all psychologists who believe in empirical idealism are transcendental realists, meaning space and time are something given in itself. They have acted, no doubt, quite consistently in ascribing great importance to empirical idealism as one of the problems from which human reason could hardly extricate itself. For indeed, if we consider outer appearances as representations, produced in us by their objects as things that are in themselves outside us, then it is difficult to see how their existence could be known otherwise, but by the inference from the effect to cause. And in this inference it must always remain doubtful whether the cause be within or without us. Now we may well admit that something, which may in the transcendental sense be outside us, is the cause of our outer intuitions. We may well admit that something which may in the transcendental sense be outside us, is the cause of our outer intuitions. But this something can never be the object which we mean by the representations of matter and corporeal things, for these are only appearances. Well, that's what you say, Kant. But we all know that I'm right. For these are only appearances. That is, the mere kinds of representations existing always only within us, and their reality depends on immediate consciousness just as much as the consciousness of my own thoughts. Yeah, I don't disagree with you, Kant, but I feel like he's just discounting the argument. The transcendental object is equally unknown to us in regard to both inner and outer intuition. Of this transcendental object, however, we are not speaking at present, but only of the empirical object, which is called outer. If it is represented in space, the empirical object, right? Which is called outer if it is represented in space, and inner if represented only in relation of time. Right. Yeah, okay. Meaning, like, an object represented in space would be like a normal whatever thing, but, like, for other things that maybe, like, I don't know, soul, something like that, it doesn't exist in space necessarily, but could exist in time. And that's, like, the, I don't know, outward aspect of it. If that makes sense. That's probably using the language too fast and loose, but both space and time, however, are nowhere to be met with except in us. Again, that's just, okay, he's just presupposing his own whatever. The expression outside us involves an inevitable ambiguity, because it may signify either something which, as a thing in itself, exists apart from us, or else something which belongs merely to outer appearance. In order, therefore, to remove all insecurity from this concept, taken in the latter meaning, in which the property affects the psychological question as to the reality of our outer intuition, we shall distinguish empirically external objects from those that may be called external in a transcendental sense, by calling them simply things which are to be found in space. We shall distinguish empirically external objects from those that may be called external in a transcendental sense. Okay. By calling them simply things which are to be found in space. Okay, it's kind of inelegant, especially for Kant. But okay, he's got a name for everything. Space and time are no doubt a priori representations which dwell in us as forms of our sensible intuition. Even before any actual object has determined our sense through sensation, enabling us to represent this object under those sensible conditions. But this something, material or real, that is to be intuited in space, necessarily presupposes perception. I feel like we're going over the transcendental aesthetic again. And cannot be fancied or produced by means of imagination independently of perception, which indicates the reality of something in space. It is sensation, therefore, that indicates reality in space and time. According to whether it is referred to the one or the other mode of sensible intuition. Once sensation is given, which, if referred to an object in general without determining it, is called perception, then through its manifoldness many an object may be put together in imagination which has no empirical position in space or time outside of imagination. Once sensation is given, which, if referred to an object in general without determining it, is called perception, then through its manifoldness many an object may be put together in imagination which has no empirical position in space or time outside of the imagination. Okay, this admits of no doubt whether we take the sensations of pain or pleasure, or the sensations of outer sense, of the outer senses, color, heat, etc. It is always perception through which the material for thinking any objects of sensible intuition must first be supplied. This perception, therefore, to speak at present of outer intuitions only, represents something real in space. This perception... Okay, he's starting to lose me, and I don't know why. Okay, I need to focus. The perception, therefore, to speak at present of outer intuitions only, represents something real in space. For firstly, perception is the representation of a reality, just as space is the representation of a mere possibility of coexistence. Secondly, this reality is represented in outer sense, that is, in space. Thirdly, space itself is nothing but mere representation, so that nothing in it can be taken as real except what is represented in it. Footnote. We must well master this paradoxical but quite correct proposition, that nothing is in space except what is represented in it. For space itself is nothing but representation, and whatever is in it must therefore be contained in the representation. There is nothing whatever in space, except insofar as it is represented in it actually. That a thing can exist only in the representation of it is a proposition that may no doubt sound strange, but it will lose its strangeness if we consider that the things with which we have to deal are not things in themselves, but only appearances. That a thing can only exist in the representation of it is a proposition that may no doubt sound strange. It doesn't sound that strange. But it will lose its strangeness if we consider that the things with which we have to deal are not things in themselves, but only appearances, that is, representations. Okay, I'm going to restart the sentence in the body. Thirdly, space itself is nothing but mere representation, so that nothing in it can be taken as real, except what is represented in it, or vice versa. Whatever is given in it, that is, whatever is represented in it through perception, is also real in it. For if it were not real in it, that is, given in it immediately through empirical intuition, it could not it could also not be created by fancy, because the real of intuitions cannot be invented a priori. Okay. I'm a little lost here. I'm starting to lose the thread a little bit. Thus we see that all outer perception immediately proves something real in space, or rather, is that real itself. Empirical realism, I'm going to read it. Objects are real, but their space... Oh, God, I can't read my writing. Objects are real, but space equals intuition. But space is an intuition? Okay. Thus we see that all outer perception immediately proves something real in space, or rather, is that real itself. Empirical realism is to this extent therefore perfectly true. That is, something real in space always corresponds to our outer intuitions. Space itself, it is true, with all its appearances as representations, exists only within me. But the real, or the material, of all objects of intuition is nevertheless given in that space actually and independently of all fancy. Nay, it is impossible that in space anything outside us, in a transcendental sense, could be given. Right, because it has to be funneled through us for us to experience it, or else it doesn't exist. We wouldn't know it. Nay, it is impossible that in this space, anything outside us, in a transcendental sense, could be given, because space itself is nothing outside our sensibility. I agree. Maybe. The strictest idealist, therefore, can never require that we should prove that the object without us, in its strict meaning, corresponds to our perception. For granted that there were such objects, they can never be represented and intuited as outside us. For if there... Okay. Because this presupposes space. And the reality in space, as the reality of a mere representation, is nothing but the perception itself. Okay, I'm going to reread this. Yeah. The strictest idealist, therefore, can never... Let's look at the idealist. Representations, the empirical idealist. Representations of senses are insufficient to make objects certain. But they also believe that space and time are something given in itself. Okay. That's transcendental realism, but empirical idealism. Okay, so this, which I think is what Kant is referring to here. The strictest idealist, therefore, can never require that we should prove that the object without us corresponds to our perception. For granted that there were such objects, they can never be represented and intuited as outside us. Because this presupposes space. Meaning... But it's just Kant just taking the position that you can't presuppose space. And therefore, this couldn't happen. And the reality in space, as the reality of a mere representation, is nothing but the perception itself. Yeah, so that's what he's saying. So you can't just posit something as existing outside of you without positing it in space. And so that idea doesn't work for him, or he argues it doesn't work for the idealists, because they're presupposing space, but they're claiming that space and time are something given in itself. So their argument falls apart. Okay. It thus follows that what is real in outer appearances is real only in perception and cannot be real in any other way. From perceptions, whether by mere play of fancy or by experience, knowledge of objects can be produced. Yeah, and here no doubt deceptive representations may arise, without truly corresponding to objects. And the deception is due either to illusions of imagination in dreams, or to a fault of judgment, the so-called deceptions of the senses. In order to escape these false appearances, one has to follow the rule that whatever is connected, according to empirical laws with a perception, is actual. This kind of illusion, however, as well as the provision against it, affects idealism as well as dualism. Since we are concerned only with the form of experience, in order to refute empirical idealism and its unfounded misgivings as to the objective reality of our outer perceptions, it is sufficient to consider that outer perception immediately proves an actuality in space, which space in itself in order to refute empirical idealism and its unfounded misgivings as the objective reality of our outer perceptions, it is sufficient to consider that outer perception immediately proves an actuality in space, which space, though in itself a mere form of representations, nevertheless possesses objective reality with respect to all outer appearances, which themselves are nothing but mere representations. And similarly, without perception, even the creations of fancy and dreams would not be possible, so that our outer senses must, with respect to the data from which experience can spring, have actual corresponding objects in space. I gotta go turn the dryer back on. Okay. The dogmatic idealist would be one who denies the existence of matter. Berkeley, right? The skeptical idealist, one who doubts its existence because he thinks that this existence is impossible to prove. Kant. Right? At present, we have nothing to do with the former, who is an idealist because he imagines that he finds contradictions in the possibility of matter in general. This is a difficulty which we shall have to deal with in the following section on dialectical inferences, which treats of reason in its inner struggle, with respect to the concepts it makes for itself, of the possibility of what belongs to the connection of experience. The skeptical idealist, on the contrary, who attacks only the ground of our assertion, and declares our conviction of the existence of matter, which we believe we have founded on immediate perception. On the contrary, who attacks only the ground of our assertion, and declares our conviction of the existence of matter, which we believe we have founded on immediate perception, as insufficient, is in reality a benefactor of human reason, because he obliges us, even in the smallest matter of common experience, to keep our eyes well open and not consider as a well-earned possession what may have come to us only by mistake. Okay, he's being pretty generous with that group. I wonder why. We shall now learn to understand the great advantage of these idealist objections. They drive us with might and main, unless we mean to contradict ourselves in our most ordinary assertions, to consider all perceptions, whether we call them inner or outer, as a consciousness merely of what adheres to our sensibility, and to consider the external objects of these perceptions not as things in themselves, but only as representations of which, as of every other representation, we can become immediately conscious. These objects are called external because they adhere to what we call the outer sense with its intuition of space. Space itself, however, being nothing but an inner kind of representation in which certain perceptions are connected with one another. If we were to admit external objects as things in themselves, then it would be simply impossible to understand how we can arrive at a knowledge of their reality outside us, considering that we always depend on representations which are inside of us. That I can't argue with. I'm going to put some stars next to it because I like it. It is surely impossible that we should feel outside us and not inside us, and the whole of our self-consciousness cannot give us anything but our own determinations. Thus, skeptical idealism forces us to take refuge in the only place I lost my spot, that is left to us, namely in the ideality of all appearances, the very ideality which, though then still unprepared for its consequences, we established in our transcendental aesthetic. Now, if we ask whether, consequently, only dualism must be admitted in psychology, we answer, certainly, but only in the empirical sense. Okay? That is to say, in the context of experience, matter, as substance in appearance, is really given to outer sense, in the same manner as the thinking I. Oh, geez. The context of experience, matter, as substance in experience, is really given to outer sense, yes, in the same manner as the thinking I, likewise as substance in appearance, is given to inner sense. And on both sides, appearances must be connected with one another according to the rules which this category introduces into the empirical connection of our outer as well as inner perceptions. I think what he's saying is like, okay, the same way that in an inner sense I am, or as a thinking I guess I should say, I am aware of myself from moment to moment. That's the same way that kind of matter is given to me from moment to moment, and is kind of empirically connected through our perception of it, I think is what he's kind of saying. If on the contrary, as often happens, we were to extend the concept of dualism and take it in its transcendental meaning, then neither it nor the two views opposed to it, pneumatism on the one hand and materialism on the other, would have even the smallest foundation. We should have missed the determination of our concepts and have mistaken the differences in our mode of representing objects which, with regard to what they are in themselves, remain unknown to us. For a difference in these things themselves, no doubt, as represented through inner sense in time and objects in space outside me, are two specifically distinct appearances. But they are not therefore thought as different things. The transcendental object which forms the foundation of outer appearances, and the other transcendental object which forms the foundation of our inner intuition, is in itself neither matter nor a thinking being, but is simply a ground to us unknown, of appearances, which supply to us the empirical concept of both. Sorry, highlighting. If therefore, as evidently this very critique forces us to do, we remain faithful to the rule established above, never to push our questions beyond where possible experience can supply us with its object, then we shall never dream of asking of the objects of our senses what they are in themselves. That is, without any references to our senses. Yes. But if the psychologist likes to take appearances as things in themselves, then, whether he be a materialist who admits into his system nothing but matter alone, or a spiritualist who admits only thinking beings, according to the form of our own inner sense, or a dualist who admits both, he will always be driven by his mistake to invent theories that which is not a thing in itself, but is only the appearance of a thing in general, could exist in itself. Sorry, putting the desk down. Okay. I think this section is actually pretty long, and I think it might make sense for me to read it separately, but I want to take a quick look. So it's starting on page 353. It is pretty long. Where does this go to? Yeah, this is too long. That's kind of thing I might push through and just like try to get a huge chunk done tonight. But I think I'm maxed out on this. Consideration of the sum total of pure psychology in consequence of these paralogisms. That seems like a good section to have by itself, especially since I'm at like an hour and 12 minutes right now. So yeah, this was actually, I feel like I got these two better than the first two paralogisms. Although now reviewing some stuff related to them, I do feel like I understand them a little better. But yeah, I've really enjoyed this section so far. And yeah, next time we'll do the, I think probably finish the A paralogism, which goes up to like 377, and then do the B paralogism. And what is after that? And then it will be the antinomy of pure reason, which I was confusing with the amphibole earlier. Okay, yeah, sounds good.